Hello, I'm your host, Peter Sawchuk, a professor of adult education and workplace learning at the University of Toronto. You're listening to Work, Learning, and Social Change Foundational Voices, an informal discussion with some of the figures who have helped to define the field. In this episode, I'm speaking with Shibao Guo, professor at the Workland School of Education, University of Calgary, Canada. One of the preeminent scholars of transnational migration and lifelong learning, he is known for his insights into the profound vulnerability and vast economic potential and triple glass effects that shape the working lives of immigrant groups. Welcome and hello to our audience. Our discussion series, if you've joined us before, is meant to be very informal. But let me begin with a few prepared remarks by way of introduction to our guest. Over the course of his lengthy and extraordinary career, Shibao Guo has methodically uncovered and re-theorized the hidden layers of immigrant experience in employment, education, and citizenship, and the specters of both overt and covert racisms that persist. Indeed, today he's arguably one of the foremost researchers of the complex intersections of work, learning, and transnational migration. Beyond his work at the University of Calgary, he's an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He's been honored with countless distinguished research awards over his career. He is an incredibly sought-after speaker in North America and around the world. He has co-authored or edited, I believe, 11 books, his most recent in 2020, entitled Decolonizing Lifelong Learning in the Context of Transnational Migration. This is from Routledge. It's been almost 20 years since I first encountered his work and started reading it, and his ever-expanding body of writing has continued to lead my own thinking and teaching and writing on the themes of work and learning. I'm very fortunate to call him a friend. Shibao, welcome to the discussion series. It's absolutely great to see your face. It's been a little bit too long, although we saw each other at one event in the summer. Thanks for taking the time to contribute to the discussion series. How are you?
I'm doing well, Peter. So it's good to see you.
Good. Yeah, I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, I'm doing well, and also thank you for including me in this activity.
Well, it's hard for me to imagine. I mean, you're a big part of, I don't know whether you know this or not, a lot of our curriculum in graduate studies around work and learning. So it feels like the whole series would have a big hole in it, a Shibao Guo shaped hole in it if we didn't have you involved in this. So I'm really pleased that you were able to do it. Yeah, it makes the whole thing worthwhile. Let me jump right into my first question and we'll get going. People want to hear from you. Your body of work is large, and as I mentioned, it's like ever expanding. Some aspects of it have evolved, but it seems to me some have remained absolutely steadfastly foundational to your research program as a whole. In this context, I want to begin by just asking you a question, which is, what is your own? How would you characterize your own work? What are your own impressions of your own work? Other people have ideas about our work, but so seldom we're asked to just characterize the nature of our own research program in a way. And so when you describe this, could you just speak to what you understand to be its strengths and what makes it distinct, and what may be its role as you see it in the field of work and lifelong learning broadly conceived?
Well, good questions. So let me just get started in terms of talking about my own work. I guess, as you said earlier, so my work primarily focuses on work, learning, and I guess social inequality in the context of transnational migration. So because the topic of migration or immigration, so there's such a very dynamic and complicated and sometimes contested kind of a field of studies. I think often we think, it's the sociologist's job, right? So, and we don't have many educators, particularly educators, who do this kind of work. So I guess, as you said earlier, so over the past 20 years, my research primarily focuses on, I guess, immigrants' labor market access, the transitions, employment, and the learning, associated with that as well. So because there's no, I guess, ready-made or agreed upon kind of approach in this kind of work. And I think, only probably starting from the new millennium, educators began to do this kind of work. So in this sense, I have to be to find approaches that work for my kind of own research interests. Yeah, so well, I really appreciate this opportunity actually to get me to reflect on some of my past work in the song. So if I reflect on those past experiences over the 20 years, so I would say in terms of approach, I have adopted kind of an interdisciplinary approach. So using intersecting methodologies across disciplines, so involving, of course, education, sociology, political philosophy, and history, etc., etc. So I think in particularly, I have used critical race theory, intersectionality theory, and more lately, decolonization. So I have also learned from the feminist theory, political philosophy, etc., etc. Maybe it's a good idea if I share some of the examples of my research and to see, how I have used the different approaches which used to shape my own research. Would that be helpful?
Oh, that would be super. No one ever asks us, like what are what we kind of would think about as signpost publications of our own. Sometimes people cite things that maybe aren't the ones that we like the most. But anyways, I don't know if that's what you're going to do. But as illustrations, yeah, if you could take us through a couple of the key publications. I have a few in the back of my mind that are favorite from yours, and I wonder if it's going to show up on your list.
Okay, if I don't, so please bring them up in a conversation. Okay, so I think first, why I choose the topic of, immigration, in a particular immigrants' labor market, access and employment as my field or my area of study. So I think this really goes back to, who I am as a researcher and my own identity and a positionality and how that shaped my own kind of a field of studies. So basically, I was born and raised in China, went to my first education in China, and I moved to the University of Nottingham to do my master's degree or MPhil in adult education. So at that time, I look at different cultural differences in terms of different conceptions for teaching and learning, teaching adults. So so I learned a lot from doing that. But after that, I moved to Canada to join my wife, who was a student here, and then later became an immigrant. So I think that change of identity really, I think, shaped my own field of studies. And then from then on, I think in the late 1990s, I began to really focus on immigration, and particularly with a strong focus on work and learning, etc., etc. To me, I think the notion of immigrant is really kind of socially and politically constructed. And so if you look at, how that had changed in Canada, I think if you look at the descendants of earlier immigrants who are primarily from Europe, so they're no longer so-called immigrants. So I think the term immigrant has really become a codified word. I think, particularly for racialized minorities like myself, who come from different, cultural and racial and national kind of backgrounds. So I think, it's important to understand, the understanding of the term of immigrant, and particularly, I think, the social construction of that. And for me, particularly important to focus on the experience of racialized immigrants. So yeah, that's basically, I guess, the term, and also how I came to the field, the topic I'm interested in. So to get into a little bit deeper in terms of the kind of the projects I have done. So one project I've done really looking at the work experience and particularly I think it's not so much workplace as well, but it's more kind of to do with the access to the labor market and also the transition. So you have done quite a bit of this work, and I remember I think I contributed a chapter to the book you and Alison Taylor did on that transition. So I think a lot of this is very important because for immigrants, it's not a linear process, right? So I think particularly we understand. So a lot of the recent immigrants, so they are highly educated and highly skilled, right? So they come to Canada because Canada needed skilled immigrants. Not only Canada, so many of them also, went to many other OECD countries, particularly those in Europe. So we'll also understand this is a very different caliber of immigrants. So come with high education, well-trained, and bring tremendous human capital, right, to the host country like Canada. So they can be called the ideal workers, actually, who are targeted by all these countries because they are highly talented, highly skillful, and highly resourceful. But at the same time, in the whole new host society, they experienced multifaceted barriers. So accessing and transitioning into the local labor market. So, there's a lot of research about this. So I think I'll just mention a few. So some of these challenges include unemployment. That's a big issue, right? And as well as underemployment. So as important as the unemployment. So language issues, and so as well as racism. So I think in a lot of the research in terms of studying immigrants' labor market access and integration. So one approach people use is the glass ceiling framework to examine their experiences. So we know glass ceiling, so it applies to particular women's career mobility, particularly in terms of how many of them move to the managerial positions. So I use that to get started with in my study, but I realized for immigrants they are very different. Because a lot of them have difficulties in getting a professional job. So, let alone moving up to managerial positions, right? Yeah, so in my work with particularly Chinese immigrant professionals, so applied the glass ceiling framework, but found so immigrants at least encountered 3 layers of barriers. Yeah, this is what I call the triple glass effect. So,
yes.
Yeah, this would include the glass gate, glass door, and glass ceiling. So I think we should be okay if I go a little bit into the detail to see a little bit more about each of them.
Yeah? Absolutely. I'm proud of myself that I've predicted exactly that. And one other one that hasn't quite it's come up yet, but yeah, the triple glass pane effect. Yeah. We teach that in our courses here. But anyways, yes. So you explain it a little bit more. This is very helpful.
Okay, yeah, because it's directly related to immigrants' work, employment, and labor market integration, etc. Yeah. So as I said, the triple glass effect includes the glass gate, glass door, and glass ceiling. So yeah, the glass gate is basically it blocks immigrants' entrance to guarded professional communities. So yeah, when I say guarded professional communities, so we know in Canada and also in other OECD countries, to practice in the field you're trained for, say for example engineering, you have to become a member of an engineering association. So for example, in Alberta, in the province of Alberta, so we have the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta, or also called APEG. So so to become a member of that association, so you have to apply. But many immigrant professionals, because their foreign credentials, they're not recognized. So either the credentials not recognized, or their experience, the work experience in the home country is not recognized. So many people, didn't have the chance to become a member to start with. So, and then from there, so they had difficulty getting a professional job, etc., etc. So that's the first layer. It's called the glass gate. Basically, blocks them to become members of the professional associations. So this is to do with the foreign credential recognition, etc. So I'll come back to it later. The second layer is the glass door. So for people who are successful in getting through the foreign credential recognition, so they need to get a job, right? They need a professional company which hosts them. But because a lot of them don't have, say, the Canadian work experience, and so therefore they don't get, I guess, the kind of job that they are trained for. So this is basically the second layer, which is the glass door, which basically blocks immigrants' access to professional employment at high wage firms. So for people who are successful in getting through the first layer, the glass gate, with the foreign credential recognized, or the second layer, which is a glass door, being successful in finding a job. So they may come across the third layer, which is a glass ceiling, which basically prevents immigrants from moving up to the kind of the high ladder of their career. So particularly managerial positions. Why? Because of their ethnic and cultural differences, or even their accent, and etc., etc. So, but when the glass gate, the glass door, and the glass ceiling, they may converge. They may converge, particularly when they converge at such a stage of immigrants' career. So they produce what I call the triple glass effect. So basically, you can see the triple glass effect. There are structural barriers that I think lead to unemployment and underemployment, downward social mobility, and poor economic performance. So that's basically, I think, one strand of my work surrounding, I think, the nature of work for immigrants. And also from there, I theorize, as you said earlier, the triple glass effect. So which you can see, the three layers basically involves both work and learning, right? And also the career mobility. So which nicely, I think, so intertwined all three, but at the same time, I think reveals a lot of issues that is to do with social inequality and structural barriers as well. So I think that's one. Probably I'll stop there to see whether you have follow-up questions or comments, etc.
Well, well, one is a comment, which is, the spatial metaphor, kind of, I always understood it as entering a courtyard, the gate, getting on, if you will, on the property in the metaphor, and then getting into the building and the door, and then trying to be recognized and being allowed and permitted to apply your skills at higher and higher levels up through or stopped by a ceiling. So I always thought the metaphor was very helpful. And I would say one of the distinct things, I'd ask you if you agree with this, about your work in the context of work and lifelong learning field broadly conceived, is that it is multi-institutional. Your conclusions come together from observations across multiple specific institutional sites that work as a matrix, or as a chain of events. Case of entry to professional work and recognition for foreign credentials, say, versus in the world of the employer and entry, labor market access and organizational access, and then within the organization. So those are like three. I always thought that one of the strengths was, at least this is how I explain it to my students, I say one of the strengths is that the strength of a multi-institutional or interinstitutional a foundation, perhaps, I don't know. Does that, am I missing something? That's how I would describe it to someone else. And see, here's might be the difference between when we get a chance to characterize our own work versus when some person on the sidelines says something about it.
Yep, I think you did well in terms of in capturing the essence of that framework. So it does involve, I think, multiple institutions, cross sectors, as well as that multifaceted. So often when we talk about immigrants' experience, in particular their transitions to work, we tend to focus on one thing.
Mhm.
Right. So, but I think, from this study, and it's clearly shown that, they're multifaceted and they're multi-layered. So I think, very important to understand, I think, the complexity
Mhm.
of the issue.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
is it also the case that it is in this complexity and this interinstitutional effects that produce a coloring of what normally would be thought of as a purely objective functional matter, which is the idea of skill as having a color? Because that was also one of the pieces that I've always recognized is that you said, listen, skill isn't just an objective functional thing that people either have or don't have. It
Yeah.
also has a color. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to several earlier works, but then, some more recent things. But it's very related, is it? This is what I'm asking. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, yeah, well, let me move on to talk about the learning part in terms of associated with particularly, I think, the recognition or devaluation of immigrants' prior learning and work experiences. So, yeah, as I just alluded to earlier, I think in the triple class, one layer of that is to do the first layer, particularly with recognition or non-recognition of immigrants' prior learning and work experience. So so definitely there have been numerous studies which show that that's a problem. That's a problem, and despite the fact that many immigrants they come to Canada and other OECD countries with bachelors, and many of them come with master's degrees, right? So, but yeah, they can't find the job in the professional field. So, because their credentials are not properly, recognized. So, we heard a lot of they almost become classic stories now. So, taxi drivers, they're doctors, lawyers, and engineers, right? And also, a lot of them are the professional engineers. So they deliver pizza or working as a parking attendant, etc., etc. So, but in this strand, for this strand, I use critical theory, particularly critical race theory, right, to trace some of the root causes leading to the problem. So in the end, I find partially of this to do with a deficit mode of difference and knowledge. I think there is basically a belief that knowledge of immigrants, particularly those from developing countries, so they are different, they are deficient, and also incompatible. So therefore, invalid. So I think for these, so you have done quite a bit of this work. I think it goes to the notion of, I think, knowledge, right? So we need to ask critical questions about the nature of knowledge. So what counts as knowledge, and how and why knowledge gets constructed the way it does, and whose knowledge is constructed valuable, and whose knowledge is silenced. So, and also, is knowledge racialized? So this is the question I think you asked. So along the side, I think it's also to do with the term skill, right? So and I think yourself, Tara Fenwick, right? And you have done really excellent work in terms of contributing to this discussion around the notion of skills. So I think we often, ask many questions, including, is skill neutral? right? So we often ask that question. So I think, when it comes to the devaluation, the descaling of immigrants' prior learning and also work experiences. So I think certainly we come with that naive notion of skill, which is to be neutral, right? Yeah, and value free. But from my own kind of work with particularly immigrant professionals, I realized actually not all foreign credentials actually are devalued, de-skilled. Yeah, yeah. Actually, so foreign credentials and skills held by, say, major member immigrants such as the British North and West Europeans, actually they bring a net earnings advantage. Yeah, and so but whose credentials got devalued, and I found actually only those credentials and skills that are held by racialized minorities, such as Africans, Chinese, and South Asians. So they suffer a skill penalty. So you can see, I think, from this analysis shows, I think there's a racialized notion of skill. Yeah, so basically, racialized immigrants, their foreign credentials, job skills, and the work experiences as well. So they are devalued and denigrated. So based on very much their skin color to which they are attached. So it is very much the color of their skill associated with their skin color rather than the skill itself. So which become, I think, in the target for descaling and devaluation. So I think this finding basically speaks to the process of racism racialization as the kind of a discriminatory practices which assign social significance to what we typically perceive as a neutral and value-free kind of concept. It also speaks to the centrality of race and the racism in producing social inequality. I think from there, basically, I guess I take a critical look at the notion of skill, and particularly in light of the racialized experiences of immigrants, and by arguing that actually skill definitely is not neutral, right? It is socially constructed, so it's not a thing. So it is an ideology, and so we tend to think a skill is colorblind, but actually, my research shows that it is colored, and so skill not only gender and class, but also racialized.
But this is it to say though that skill is and knowledge are only ideology and subjectively or socially constructed by in total, or that it's a mix of some aspects of what I guess in a very conventional sense would be skill and knowledge in an objective sense, but that it's I'm asking you, but that it's underplayed the whole ideological face or socially constructed face of skill, but it's in fact two-faced. Is your approach admit those things? I always thought that it did.
Yeah, I think probably has both, but for the immigrants, basically, I think there's a heavy weight, particularly on the ideological kind of aspect of skills.
That face of it is the defining face of it in their lives.
That's right.
And then hyper contradictory is the fact that now the world, certainly every G10 country in the world is demanding, or at least the economists say, every G10 country needs immigration, especially the type of essentially gold standard immigration that you described, highly skilled, highly credentialized, and that it might surprise the audience, but it doesn't surprise you that the Canadian government recently made an historic announcement in
Yeah.
terms of immigration planning. And
Yeah.
so all this fits in a lot with what you expect, which is this combination. I've always read in your work this combination of economic potential and value
Mhm.
combined with vulnerability
Yeah.
and oppressions at the same time.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. I think goes hand in hand. It's true. So as you said earlier, immigration has become a policy priority for many countries, right? So I mean, if you look at the policy debate in Canada, so often, so immigration is a hot topic.
Mm.
So the same as in many other countries like Germany, the US, and in the UK, et cetera, et cetera. So particularly with the declining maternity rate and also kind of a growing aging population. So I think many countries like Canada do rely on immigration for population growth, to meet the kind of growing demands of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, I think you see these discrepancies, right? You see these contradictions.
Mm.
I think between the policy and the practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think the policy, you can see, well, I think, the priorities of immigration, particularly for the thirst for, highly skilled, highly resourceful, and highly talented workers. But on the other hand, I think, the lack of support, for immigrants and also all these different challenges. So the other aspect I think which is important in my work is applying the intersectionality approach to kind of examine their experiences. So just now I talk about the critical race theory, which is important. But on the other hand, I think the CRT alone actually doesn't cannot I think cover all the complexities
Mm.
because immigrants, say for example, immigrant male from Norway, so the experience would be very different from a single mother, so with a refugee status, from say Africa. So in this sense, I do go beyond the critical race theory alone by looking at, how race, class, gender, and sexuality, etc., how they intersect in shaping people's different experiences and how they contribute to in terms in the producing the social inequality. So I
Mm-hmm.
think by only covering all the different complexities, we have a better understanding of the whole landscape of work and the learning and social inequality in the context of immigration.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you would comment and make a distinction between a kind of interinstitutional analysis, something that we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, which I see as very closely married with critical race theory in the sense that it it had its roots in a type of legal but interinstitutional analysis. It certainly has emerged that way over the last 10 to 20 years in terms of kind of systemic or another term for interinstitutional things. And then I really like the way you also then have put it there, which is it's one thing to know about different institutions and even how they relate, but then what is going on with different dynamics within these institutions and the notion of even just the idea of experience and intersectionality in terms of nature of experience. So one toolkit, conceptual toolkit isn't enough for you. Is that fair to say?
No, I would say no. So, but I think, the critical race theory and intersectionality, so they are so closely kind of interconnected, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's very hard to separate them. But nevertheless, I find combining them is very effective. So the other part of the approach which guides my work is the political philosophers. So and also the feminist theories, which I find also helpful, particularly in my early work on the foreign credential recognition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I took the angle of social justice. So, and particularly in light of Nancy Fraser's work, the spheres of justice. So, by looking at the distributive justice, retributive justice, as well as the recognitive justice, and particularly in the special issue I did for the International Journal of Lifelong Education. So I think, I theorize the notion of transnational lifelong learning for recognitive justice and inclusive citizenship. So I think, I learned from, two philosophers. So in that work, so one is Nancy Fraser, the other one is Iris Morin-Young in terms of the differentiated citizenship.
Yeah.
And so the other aspect is the whole notion of transnational migration, so which also guides my work. And this is quite different from the kind of earlier, more kind of conventional notion of, immigration or migration. So I think the earlier notion of immigration is usually one direction. So either moving, say, from India to Canada or from China to Canada. And then, so you forget about, your past, and then, so you're pretty much uprooted, right? And you expected in the early notion of assimilation. So you are expected to be assimilated into the, the host society and the culture. So, but, with the kind of changing, particularly transportation technology and integration of the world economy, and so on and so forth. So we see a more kind of intensified globalization. People are constantly on the move. So they are no longer just, uprooted, so from China to Canada, but on the other hand, so they maintain connections with their home country. So, cultural anthropologists and also sociologists, Alejandro Portes, we usually call them, simultaneity. And so they maintain that interconnections between their host society as well as, their kind of whole country of origin. And so in this sense, migration became more kind of a circular and transnational. So that's pretty much, how I approach, the whole notion of migration.
Well, on the level of human experience, it's, returning to what you had said earlier, which is from linear to, non-linear migration, it's whether it's a pendulum or a circular, you've written about as well in terms of cycling. And then telecommunications and travel, as you say, it just combines the human experience such that even those who would champion a kind of a pure assimilationist perspective, it's an impossibility under these circumstances. And so the aspect of it on lived experience and learning in citizenship across institutions like work and others are make it highly complex in this day and age.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in the past, I still remember, when I moved to Canada in the early 1990s. So basically, telephone, that's the only way of communicating. So say, for example, with family members, say in China, but at that time, so 1 minute of long distance telephone is pretty much, my food for the day. $3 a minute, and that's how expensive it was. But now with the social media, with the, all these different technologies, so you can pretty much, watch the same TV show, with people back, say, in the country of origin. So I took a look at particularly the mobility of the Chinese population and the changing nature of the Chinese diasporas. So I put together 3 categorizations which can be used to describe, the current Chinese population mobility. So which are called hypermobility, and a hyper diversity, and a hyper connectivity. So the hyper, let me see what I mean by these three terms. So the hypermobility, so we know, see, the Chinese is a highly mobile kind of group of people, right?
Mhm.
And so they started, very early, probably a century ago, and primarily moving to, Southeast Asia, etc., etc. Only starting from in the mid 1800s, it started to move to North America and Europe, etc., etc. But now I think the population certainly has shifted from the earlier kind of mobility to Asia to different parts of the country of the world. So now I realize, I think there are about probably 50 to 60 million people living
Mhm.
in the diaspora. So in that sense, and also they live in different corners, different parts of the world. So almost in every country, and you can see it's a highly mobile kind of population. So that's the hyper mobility. So the second part is about the hyper diversity. So we tend to think they are just one group of people from China, from ancient China, speaking the same language, right, and with the same history, and etc., etc. But actually, there's a huge kind of a diversity and subgroup differences, within that group. And so the typical group we see in Canada, so they are Mandarin speakers and the Cantonese speakers, right? So the Cantonese speakers are more from Hong Kong and that region, and the Mandarin speakers from northern China, and also they come with different linguistic background and different religion.
Mhm.
Because some of them Buddhists, some of them also Christians, and some of them also Muslims, and some of them are immigrants directly from China, but there are also many re-immigration. Say, for
Mhm.
example, from Malaysia, from the
Mhm.
Caribbean. So there's a huge diversity. So that's the hyper diversity part. Third part is the hyper kind of connectivity.
Mhm.
Yeah, because of the things we just talked about in terms of transportation technology, and internet, the digital technology. So, and people are no longer just worried about paying a high long distance phone bill, because we don't need that anymore, right?
Yeah.
People can use Instagram, and people can use WeChat, etc., etc. It's even free. So, and I think that certainly keep people connected. So all these, I think, help with that transnational migration movement.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's just an artifact from the ground somehow that in our lives, because we're close to the same age, I think, and we used to worry about phone bills and long distance and how long we might be on there and how much it would cost and all that stuff. And now I'm on a WhatsApp with someone from Kenya just 2 days ago. It's strange, with yeah, although there's hidden costs in that way. I'm conscious of your time, and there's a couple other things I want to ask you, and there's a very important last question I want to ask you, which is very important to young researchers. But one other kind of question: you covered a ton of ground. You've characterized in a way that I learned something new from the way you characterized your kind of research approach overall, and you've also spoken to a kind of a careful mix of conceptual theoretical tools that you draw on and key inspirations. But I want to ask you this question more about the absence of something. Are there things in your mind that you wish to pursue in the future? I know I have a few things like this. Either whether it's a whether it's a kind of reading a little bit more on a theory and bringing that and applying it to some concepts, or maybe it's a methodology, or maybe it's a type of study. For instance, I've on and off in my career, I've been fascinated by, what time use studies are. These very careful documentation and gathering of what people do, kind of sometimes even hour by hour course of a day. I've always been fascinated by marrying that with lifelong learning research. It's something that's always been in the back of my mind. Do you have anything in the back of your mind that you hope to get to before you decide to take a long deserved rest or retirement or something?
Yes, well, no, well, thank you for that question. I do have something at the back of my mind, that I want to do and haven't done that. So that is also to do with, I think, what is going on currently in Canada and North America and many other countries. So this is ongoing. I think different forms of racism that confronts our society, and so I think we have heard particularly during the COVID-19. So we tend to think Canada is a democratic society, right? So we adhere to the democratic principles of social justice and equity, etc., etc. And also immigrants and refugees are said to be welcome. But on the other hand, we see these ongoing kind of racism and racial discrimination, particularly during COVID-19. And particularly in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and also Calgary as well. So where there is a strong presence of Asian Canadians and particularly those of Chinese descent. And so because of COVID, so they became almost the kind of the scapegoat, for allegedly spreading the virus and etc. etc. So we have seen tons of incidents of anti-Asian racism. So some of them have been spat on, some of them have been verbally abused and physically attacked, and etc. etc. So all these really kind of affects adversely, I think, immigrants' integration process. And we also saw, other forms of racism, right, including anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism, particularly, with the death of Floyd, etc., etc. So I think all these, I think become a concern for a scholar like myself, I think, who's interested in particularly, I think, the lived experiences of immigrants. And so in their new society. So I think something which I would like to do really kind of look at the anti-racism movement, and particularly take such a movement as particularly theorize the learning part from it by focusing on the social movement learning. I think you have done some work in this area, and in Canada, but Ho has done a lot of work in this area too, right? So, I mean, in terms of work, I think we saw a lot of racism at the workplace, in the public space, etc., etc. So, for my next stage, so at the back of my mind, so I want to do some more kind of participatory action research. Using particularly immigrants' racialized experiences as an entry point for looking at different forms of racism, and more importantly, focusing on the anti-racism as a form of social movement, in addition to the labor rights movement and also the women movement earlier. So to see how different or how similar they are. And particularly theorizing, I think, the learning part of all of that. So that is something that I have been thinking about.
Well, I had a period of my career where I was very much focused on some of those issues as well. But you bring up, from your past work, you bring a unique toolkit, a whole range of things to bear around interinstitutional perspectives on social movement learning, which there's not a lot of that in the Canadian context, and I'm not sure where things stand. I've kind of lost touch a little bit with the social movement learning research, but it's a fascinating field, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. That's what I find as well. So I think I can't remember when was the last piece I read, but I think it seems there has been a kind of absence in the almost in the last decade now, right?
I don't know if it's just my own anecdotal experience, but there's something about it that rings true from what you just said.
Yeah.
I seem to read less of it in the journals than I did maybe about 5 or 10 years ago.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
like
then
I
also,
remembered Bud Hall's big review where he kind of brought all together, big literature review, him and Thomas, I think the late Thomas Turre.
okay.
Um, it kind of was a compendium of a lot of social movement learning research in North America and
Yeah.
elsewhere. And that was quite some time ago now. You know how
Yeah.
we've been in our careers a little while and
Yeah.
things can
Yeah, that's
sometimes,
true. But I'll keep you updated on that. How about
yeah,
that? Yeah.
absolutely. I'm
Yeah.
very conscious of the time. I forget if I
Okay.
mentioned that, and I don't want to keep you too long.
Right.
Um, and there's a very important question I ask every interviewee in these, or discuss it in our foundational voices series. These are experienced scholars who are leading the way in various ways. And the key question is really for young or new research, not
Okay.
always young,
Right.
new researchers, and especially for doctoral students.
Okay.
What kind of words of advice would you have for doctoral students seeking to launch into the field of research, whether in academia or elsewhere, especially as it may or may not relate to your specific area of expertise? Do you have advice that you give to newer researchers?
Well, I think, one thing which I think important, so by reflecting on my work is find something you feel passionate about, and also find a topic you can personal connected with. So, well, earlier on I talked about particularly how my own identity and positionality as a researcher shape and form my own research interests. So, well, not necessarily everybody will do immigration studies, but I think it's important that when people choose a topic or field of study, so that uh, they can they need to ask some questions, about the topic to see whether they feel strongly passionate about, and they feel that they can personally connect it with,
Mm.
and if so, and so they should be uh, feel that determination in terms of you know um, uh, doing that topic, uh, and also be open with the different approaches, right? We just talked about, and so it's very important to avoid that recipe kind of approach,
Mm.
right? So um, well, so and so use this one, so it produces good works, so therefore it's a good choice for me, but not necessarily, right?
Hmm.
So I think it's important, to be open-minded, and then think how that connect to you. And also for a lot of visualized minority students, I think um, you know in my earlier work, I look at a lot of the role models, such as people like Peter Lee in sociology, and etc. etc. So, and Roxana on at your own faculty. So I think it's also important, to talk to people in the field, and also who share similar experiences, and find a role model. I think which is also kind of important, certainly for my own experience.
Hmm. Hmm. Good words of advice. It's so challenging. Well, the passion is necessary because you have to do this for so long. I completely agree with you. For students, because they're going to be doing this stuff probably for a while, at least during the length of a advanced degree. And then the open-mindedness, and then the role models. Yeah, it's so important to have a role model. I stumbled across a few early in my career that really were helpful too. So yeah, I agree with you there. It's something that's sometimes not emphasized enough. Okay, I very much appreciate your time. And I think I'll bring us to a close. Are there any final things you'd like to say to me or the audience for that matter?
Just want to say thank you again for including me, and also for all this excellent work. And so it's actually a good opportunity for me to reflect on my own work as well. So thank you.
Yeah, it has well, actually, everybody says that it's rare to have the opportunity to just reflect and talk about your own work over an extended, not a huge amount of time, but a long form interview, like we say. So I really appreciate it. I learned a lot from it, even though I feel like I'm a bit of an expert on your work, but from the outside anyways. And I guess I'll just say goodbye then.
Okay. Thank you so much again.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll
Yeah.
talk
Take
soon.
care.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Yeah. Bye, Peter.